Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Dark topic for today, but a good one. What's the worst way you've ever heard of someone dying? Some of these might be a little unsafe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. In the recent earthquake in Turkey, a woman and her baby in her arms got stuck after their building collapsed. They were able to talk and hear outside, but unable to come out. People around were trying to relax her, saying the help is on the way. The weather was extremely cold. After a couple of hours, the woman said, "Leave me. Go look for other people. My baby is dead." And she waited to die with her baby's frozen corpse in her arms. Makes me get the chills. I knew some folk who died when a hot air balloon crashed into power lines. The balloon ignites and basically becomes plastic nylon magma that covered the basket and all of the people inside it. There's a photo of two guys on a giant wind turbine that caught on fire. One jumped to his death, the other burned alive. Probably not the worst, but man, seeing that photo of them hugging each other right before was like getting punched in the chest. At my university, there was a guy who wanted to sneak in at an event at a student club, so he thought it would be an awfully good idea to climb down the chimney, and he of course got stuck. And this was just before the summer leave, so the entire place was closed down while he was still stuck in the chimney. When they came back, they discovered the stench from his corpse. He must have thirsted or suffocated to death in that place, hour after hour just sitting there. Really bad way to go. I'm a farmer. One of the neighbors was baling hay and got out to clear a jam with the round baler running. His leg got caught in the tines, and he was pulled into the machine and crushed, then spun around and around for over an hour before he was found. Absolutely terrible way to go. I once read about an amusement park tragedy where there was a log ride that collapsed, and the carrier dropped the people essentially into a gear meat grinder. 2 children survived out of like a dozen people by clinging onto the safety bars until their arms went numb. The emergency crew who came to save them described it as the most horrific thing they ever witnessed, and many still need therapy to this day to help them cope with the aftermath they witnessed. I remember when I was young, hearing about an incident in a sawmill in a neighboring town. 3 guys crawled inside the mill's debarking machine, basically a giant drum lined with teeth that tear bark off of sawn logs. They climbed inside to do some kind of maintenance, but didn't lock the machine out properly. I think basically when the next shift arrived, they didn't know anyone was in there, and they kicked it back on to start their day. I assume it would be quick, but they almost literally were put through an industrial wood chipper. I mean, thanks to the film Fargo, the idea of a wood chipper and a human body is just burned into your memory forever. So just the image is pretty horrendous. All of these are horrible, so I'm really only picking and choosing some random ones, but they're all bad. I saw a video a few days ago of a mother of 2 wanting to do a polar plunge, so they opened up a hole in a channel, and as soon as she jumped in, the current of the water underneath swept her away under the ice and she died. Imagine the panic that went through her mind as she was trapped under the ice, not to mention the freezing temperatures she exposed herself to. That has to be one way I don't want to go. Man got trapped in his closet by a fallen cabinet. He was recluse, so nobody was coming to check on him. He realized he had to save himself and broke through the ceiling and broke a pipe off, intending to tunnel his way out. It was a water pipe, and cold water started hitting down from above. It was several days before he died, trapped in the closet with water beating on his head. The only reason he was found was because the neighbors stopped hearing him banging for help and suddenly got nervous and called the police to check on things. Secure your heavy furniture, y'all. In Australia during the bushfires, a family were cut off and trapped, so they jumped into their water tank to avoid the fire. They all ended up being boiled alive. My friend's husband choked to death at the dinner table in front of his wife and young kids last year. In my own personal life, my mom knew a girl who was killed by a group of young guys who were driving drunk. I forget the specifics of it, but Essentially, she got hit by a car and was dragged a number of miles while hooked onto the back of it, with the friction essentially burning her skin off, I'm guessing. The driver of the car left her body at the side of the road and ditched her clothes in the sea. He got charged with manslaughter or something eventually, but he came from an upper-class old money family, and his dad helped him with his court case. He now works as a chef in a local restaurant, which of course my mother refuses to enter. This was a long time ago, by the way, probably early 70s. Basically, any caving incident where someone got stuck and couldn't be rescued, so they just had to stay pinned there till they died. Nutty Putty is probably the most well-known one, but I read about one recently where someone got stuck in a pit where there was really poor airflow, and the whole rescue team wasn't able to get them out, so they just had to stay there, slowly poisoning the air around them with their own exhaled CO2 until it suffocated them. I feel like at a certain point, you just ask for a morphine OD. As someone mentioned, Hisashi Oichi was quite cruel due to the prolonged suffering. However, there are a few other notorious cases that were quite gruesome. Nutty Putty Cave incident, there was that guy who got stuck head first in a narrow path in a cave. Even though people tried to rescue him and nearly succeeded, he died in the end due to suffocation after 28 hours. James Prout, a vulnerable man, tortured for weeks and ultimately killed by some sickos, which can nearly be described as cult-like. Byford Dolphin accident. 5 saturation divers on an oil rig were killed because one of them made a mistake in which the diving bell was disconnected from the living chamber before the living chamber was closed properly, which led to an explosive decompression, which means the crew members literally just exploded in an instant. They probably didn't feel much, but it was pretty gruesome. Junko Furuta, for me the most disturbing one because of how vile her death was. She was just 17 years old and got kidnapped by some classmates. She was held hostage for 44 days. During that time, she was AR'd repeatedly and also beaten and tortured. I'll not go into details here, but one of the perpetrators apparently lost a game of mahjong and then decided to let out his frustration on Junko by beating her and ultimately setting her on fire, leading to her death in the end. It really must have been hell. The case was highly discussed because a lot of people thought the sentence for the perpetrators was too low for what they did. Also, apparently, one of the perpetrators' mothers actually had the nerve to call out the parents of the victim for ruining their son's life, which just adds to the insanity. Knew a kid who was driving on a windy day, stopped at a stop sign at the top half of this big-ass tree had snapped and fell onto his car. He was a mixture of crushed and punctured by the tree, but was still alive. Someone called 911 and the fire department and EMS show up and realized the tree fell onto power lines, and they had to wait for the power company to shut them off before they could attempt to get him out. He ended up dying before they could get to him, and I always think of how terrible it must have been for him to be sitting there in pain, just watching emergency services stand there, looking at him. And in this one in particular, the person did nothing wrong. It was just wrong place, wrong time. And that's a tragedy. There was a highway worker for Caltrans working at night on the 405 in Irvine who was killed when a drunk driver hit him and jammed in between his work truck's bed and the driver's vehicle, sort of. The impact was so hard that it severed the poor 23-year-old man, whose wife was 5 months pregnant, in two at his abdomen. They say he died from loss of blood before the paramedics were even able to leave their station on the call. I used to work with someone who lost her husband, married for 1 year, during a snowmobile trip. He and his friends went for a night ride and some crazy piece of shit apparently had a wire of some kind strung across the trail. He was first in line and hit it. He was decapitated, and his friend not only had to deal with that, but also had to inform his wife, too. I remember this video of a guy in a factory. He was near a machine that was like a huge cylinder, and it was spinning and had these metal grips all around it. I think part of his uniform sleeve got stuck, so he immediately tries to pull it out before his arm is sucked into the machine and crushed and ripped apart. And then his entire body gets pulled into it while the machine spins faster and faster. and flings his body parts all over the area he's in. He's doing that for a good 30 seconds before another worker runs over and stops the machine. His entire body was literally vaporized and torn apart and flung everywhere within 15 seconds of his arm getting stuck. It was insane. Worked a rail accident. Driver tried to beat a train, got pushed into a pole, lots of damage both sides of car. He was conscious and alert for medics who thought he was okay, until they released his seatbelt. He had loads of internal injuries, and the belt was holding things more or less in place. If they had known, they would have tried to get his family there to say goodbye. ISIS hung 3 men from a swing set by their limbs and lit a very slow-moving fire that slowly got closer and closer until they caught on fire and burned to death, screaming in agony. In natural, sick ISIS fashion, they filmed it. Effing savages, man. A few years back, a 14-year-old kid was helping his uncle cut down some trees. He fell into the wood chipper. Another one was a motorcyclist wrecking his bike while speeding and got thrown into a chain-link fence. He went about halfway through the fence and was just stuck in it until he died. Friend's father got his dry-as-bone coat caught in a PTO shaft of a farming implement. I was working with the ambulance service at the time, knew the officers that went to the scene. They all had time off because of how horrific it was. Apart from extremities, he was pulverized. But the real trauma was from having to attend my friend who found him. He never truly recovered. She wasn't dead yet, but she was dying. I hope she's dead. Patient in ICU when I was in clinical. She had a cardiac arrest months ago and was paralyzed vegetable from anoxic brain injury. We got her from one of the shittier nursing homes. She coded in the ER several times and they kept bringing her back. Eventually, she was stabilized enough for us to get to her. She had a trach and was being mechanically ventilated, maxed out on vasopressors to keep her blood pressure from tanking. She had pneumonia. She had a catheter with a UTI. She had C. diff from sepsis, and the cardiac arrest, her temperature kept rising. She had a fever of plus 105. She had C. diff and a rectal tube. She had infected pressure sores on her sacrum and both hips, so no matter which way she was turned, she was lying on one of them. The rectal tube leaked liquid stool around the balloon and was soaking the sacral wound bandage in feces. They kept inflating the balloon of the rectal tube, which pushes the leaking stool against the rectal wall, so she was probably developing necrosis in her rectum and on her way to dissolving her intestine. Her family wouldn't make her DNR. When her son wouldn't even stay on the call long enough for the doctor to ask to make her DNR because he was too busy. I don't know what she did to him for him to let us keep torturing her. I could see one of her eyes following me and had a feeling she was still in there, completely paralyzed with no way to communicate while her body rotted while she was still alive, being brought back over and over again with no hope for recovery. I hope I was wrong, and I hope she died soon after. That's some level of cruelty and terrible to hear. So hopefully she found peace wherever she went after life. Back in the early 90s, a pilot landed his OH-58 helicopter in the desert, hopped out with the delivery of documents, and while looking at said paperwork, walked around the back of his aircraft and into the tail rotor blades. It ripped him from low in the ribs up to his collarbone. It took 20 minutes for a medevac Black Hawk to arrive, package him up, and depart for a hospital. He died in surgery. He was completely aware the whole time. He was in unbelievable pain, even after the medics hit him with morphine, twice. It's a memory that often resurfaces for a variety of reasons.